Fighters are small, quick, and maneuverable. Although they're lightly armed and shielded, they perform integral tasks for any fleet. They're often the most effective counters to roving enemy fighter swarms, as well as providing excellent bomber formation escorts or powerful complements to cruiser patrols. Fighters are useful for reconnaissance and scouting, and their small mass makes entry and exit from Atma easy, allowing effective close air support for ground assault. Although their engines have a short range and the sum total of their firepower seems weak, a fleet without fighters will find itself at a severe disadvantage. Bombers are heavy and slow, weighed down with their payloads. Although they may be heavily shielded and some even armed, they see limited use in space combat as their cumbersome maneuvering necessitates constant. Escorts and torpedoes are easily destroyed by EMPs from larger ships, unless they are carefully coordinated with plasma cannon bursts. Split the power consumption. Bombers are one of the few ships to still use kinetic weaponry, as no military has cracked the physics of energy-based torpedoes. If a navy makes use of them, they're usually deployed in already controlled void space to strike planetary surfaces or orbital stations. Frigates are most often used for convoy bodyguards or peacekeeping enforcement. They're still small enough to handle Atma without inordinate fuel expenditure, but large enough to police all but the most well-armed populaces with their gun turrets and garrisons. In combat, they'll often take on anti-fighter roles as they are maneuverable enough to easily target the fast-moving craft, and their shields can hold against fighters' plasma cannons for some time. However, frigates are vulnerable to larger ships and so must be sheltered. Only the largest frigates are able to travel hyperspace without having their hand held through the jump. Cruisers bridge the gap between small frigates and massive frontline battleships. These vessels are effective from high-priority escort missions and FTL lane patrols to broadside lines and providing close orbit cover for surface invasions. Cruisers boast both a highly versatile mix of anti-fighter and heavier cannons, as well as hangars able to deploy fighters and several frigates. Well-supplied crews will stock kinetic-guided missiles, but this is more of a what-if than for actual combat effectiveness. These ships carry the resources to invade a small moon. They are also large enough to be standardized with the tech necessary to make hyperspace jumps through FTL lanes. By far, cruisers are the most plentiful ships across the galaxy with a highly beneficial cost. Effectiveness trade-off. Almost all species can afford to field a cruiser-based fleet without any significant economic strain. Take one more step up and now you're playing with the big boys. Battleships. The deployment of the first of these behemoths by the Shrike military centuries ago revolutionized the way battles were fought. The framework around which these massive ships were constructed has come to be called the all-big gun design and allowed them unparalleled dominance for decades after their introduction until they were adopted as the backbone of many navies. Conventional military theory dictated that after the fighter skirmishes had felt out the power of each fleet, naval battles would first be fought at range with powerful cannons and then gradually devolve into closer engagements where smaller, quicker-firing guns and more maneuverable ships would prove to have greater effectiveness. The first battleships were thought to be a waste of resources as they were heavily shielded and lethargic compared to the cruisers of the enemy's sus fleets and lacked anti-fighter batteries or other methods of neutralizing smaller hostile craft. The slow-firing but colossal plasma cannons, however, soon proved their worth as their immense energy blasts overwhelmed ion shields and mutilated enemy hulls long before antagonistic ships had their range. Smaller hostile ships could be cleaned up at their leisure with launches from the battleship's hangar bays, or alternatively just left to fend for themselves. Smaller craft can't make jumps through FTL lanes and will freeze in the void with depleted fuel cells. In response to this escalation of the arms race, new ships were constructed built around new technology known as the Disruptor. These ultra-long-ranged energy beams leached away the shields of enemy battleships. Without their shields and unable to target smaller craft, battleships had to rely on frigates for protection from fighters and ultimately forced engagements to move back into close combat if disruptors were present. Xenofuel cells were developed to endure for as long as possible as they must account for the possibility of being stranded in the cold expanse. Because of the duration, they are relatively slow to charge their capacitors and lack the rate of fire for a true point defense solution, forcing them to rely on EMP bursts or smaller support craft to deal with missiles and fighters. However, disruptors require immense power consumption and fuel cell technology. like any tech, is limited. The disruptors themselves cannot fire without sacrificing engine and shield effectiveness, becoming almost defenseless while in use. A few navies build comparable ships by regressing to primitive kinetic weapons. Basically just half-a-kilometer-long railguns with engines riveted to the back. But these are few and far between and suffer from the same weaknesses that plague disruptors. Also, kinetic weaponry was abandoned for a reason. Disruptor tech is reminiscent of heavy artillery on a surface. Expensive, massive, a pain in the ass to maneuver and protect, and able to turn a battle in seconds. Carriers and troop transports provide virtually identical functions, though one for flesh and one for machine. They convey smaller craft or soldiers through the jump, as well as provide a base of operations for military campaigns. Currently, limited defenses are available to these ships. Available energy sources merely cannot endure the massive draw of shields. Life support systems, housing, feeding engines, thrusters, artificial gravity, etc., and also power weapons platforms. Modern engineering methods have also seemed to reach their upper limit, as simply adding more fuel cells doesn't return a cost-effective solution. The mass being a severe limiting factor. It could be argued that constructing these craft on a smaller scale would allow more defenses, but most strategists consider the downsizing of contained assets to again lack operational effectiveness. May as well just make another cruiser. Capital ships are floating. Militaristic cities constructed and deployed by only powerful planetary governments or wealthy consortiums. Although a couple of these can blockade an entire planet, they almost never see combat. If you can imagine back to where nuclear weapons were a credible threat before Lassert was adopted and then abandoned, these capital ships would be the nukes. Ships of this size and power facing off usually result in a Cold War, both because of the destruction they are capable of, as well as the fact that losing one might just bankrupt an entire continent. Although capital ship has colloquially come to be used as slang for anything big and well-armed, there are rare occasions when militaries are forced to use the term literally. These are dark times. Although there exist 9 uncountable classes, every navy is structured around these 8 types of ship. As a blacksmith used hammer and anvil to forge blades eons ago, ships are the tools to forge an empire among the stars. Xenos have been making ships for a long time. Species were launching rockets before Terran figured out abandoning the nomad life was worth it because cities made it easier to make beer. When you've been making ships that long, space combat boils down to a science. And the most powerful navies are the ones who adhere most strictly to this science. This framework allows militaries to operate at peak efficiency. The equation solved for maximum effectiveness with the least resources expended. Every species knows the science. Every fleet plays by the rules. Do not make the mistake of thinking because of this structure that combat among the stars is stagnant and unchanging. War is a beast that constantly evolves. To remain still is to be the mouse that crouches motionless, waiting for the eagle to dive. Strategies are ever-changing, advancing, progressing. Knowledge of the current metagame will make a commander competent. Perfect execution will make him good. Perfect execution with counters to the opponent's execution will make him great. But perhaps once in a century, there will arise a commander whose brilliance for combat transcends mere greatness. A leader whose awareness extends beyond his own fleet, whose vision encompasses the entire battlefield. This creature will not see just the ships and the stars and the planets in range of his sensor screens, but will possess a field presence far greater than mere mortals can hope to achieve. This individual commands an encyclopedic knowledge of tactics, statistics, probabilities, mathematics, physics. But his proficiency cannot be quantified with bare data. He possesses the spark of true genius. He doesn't see the rules. He sees guidelines, predictions of how his opponent will behave. He doesn't see ships. He sees schematics, hulls, drive engines, fuel reserves, cannons, crews, fire rates, and gun velocities. You see a moon orbiting a gas giant. He sees the orbital rings that can be used for gunship deployments like the high ground on a surface. He knows the moon on its orbital path will block sight lines to hide battleships on its dark side. He knows the chemical makeup of the gas that can be manipulated to return false positives to enemy deep space probes. He knows scanners can be fooled by hiding in the radiation from a sun flare. By the time you see a gravity well, his mind is already calculating time dilation or envisaging trapping enemy fleets in the crushing pressure. Or perhaps he concludes that you know of his mastery and his fleet will simply forge ahead with a brute force frontal assault. You can try to run, but he's already had you surrounded, foregoing FTL lanes to slingshot his capital ships past the event horizon of a black hole. He will use the same tools in ways which have never been imagined. He is unbeatable, but what if you change the tools? What if you play a different game? Terra harbored no delusions about how pathetically outclassed it was on the galactic stage. It had been forced to sit at the poker table with Uno cards and Monopoly money. Although the sickness had driven the Shriek back into the void, it was only a matter of time until their fleets returned. Terra knew the Shrike would not suffer risk. Orbital bombardment would boil the seas and glass the sand, leaving behind a species too weak to put up even the most pathetic of resistance. Digging through the wreckage of the ships that had been destroyed or abandoned in flight, Terra discovered undamaged sections in the burned-out hulls of the fleet. For the first time, scientists and physicists had unfettered access to alien tech. The OS, schematics, materials, and construction styles were analyzed, dissected, studied. It took months before the first breakthrough came. But with this breakthrough, Terran's scientific advancement was catapulted nearly 200 years beyond the projected learning curve. Now Terra was only significantly outclassed. Construction began on Terrara's first ship. The best Terra had to offer augmented with broken Shriek tech. Unable to crack the physics behind Shriek energy-based weapons, an Iowa-class battleship was dismantled and two cannibalized Mark 7 guns fitted onto a hull of 12-thick reactive plating. Enemy ships weren't armored, but engineers only had a best-guess prototype of Shrike ion shielding. SOs judged a necessary move to reduce the risk of accidents that would result in explosions and fire. The guns weren't armed with shells, but instead solid iron slugs. Two 30mm chain guns were added for anti-fighter duty, these with limited rounds. Rudimentary fire control systems were implemented to reduce the risk of malfunction of traditional rounds. The first drive engines were completed, having been built by exactly mirroring undamaged ones. Despite being overclocked beyond their rated maximum thrust, they were barely able to drag the armored and kinetically armed ship off the high-grav planet. From orbit, the first testing began of hyperspace travel. Terran scientists had no knowledge of FTL lanes or jump points, and assumed wormholes could be generated from anywhere. When the hyperspace jumps obviously failed, engineers stripped apart the engines intending to fix them. It was 4 in the morning when a physicist with a bloodstream of mostly Fireball whiskey stumbled onto the galactic equivalent of sliced bread. The equations he derived that night simultaneously led to the construction of the jump drive as well as decrypted the Xeno reliance on relay stations to make jumps through FTL lanes. Terra realized it had an advantage of a magnitude never before seen in warfare. Although the jump drives were inaccurate, sometimes landing significantly more than hundreds of thousands of km off the destination point. This is almost infinitesimally small compared to the unimaginable vastness of space and could easily be adjusted for. Humanity had become nearly equal with God. Terran warships were all but omnipresent. The MKI was launched unofficially christened a Vengeance-class warship. Skipping behind enemy forward jumps points to undefended home worlds. It ravaged the planets, jumping away from defensive fleets to rearm and refuel before spawning again in Xenoid space. The Shriek deployed their fleets in defensive positions, unsure how formidable their opponent was. This gave the Terran Navy room for one deep breath. The Enk-2 was first developed from the recycled parts of its predecessor. Terra knew the Shriek would quickly discover how fragile was their enemy. Despite the jump drives, one ship against thousands are odds no sane creature would take. The Terran military needed a vessel that would be able to fight toe-to-toe with enemy ships of the line when necessary to keep the Shriek isolated from FTL. Lanes to keep fleets stranded from supply lines to blockade home worlds. Despite billions being poured into research and development, there was no progress on energy weapons and minimal advancement with ion shields. Engineers ignored both, instead building it like a tan. Offensively weak but heavy, durable, and able to take a hit. Redundant systems and cataphract-like armor made it one of the heaviest warships for its size in the void. Launching required the assistance of chemical combustion in addition to the standard drive engines and thrusters. The Mk2S strengthened the Terran military enough to again check the advance of hostile fleets by selecting few strategic engagements and jumping away before serious firepower arrived. It was dubbed the Gladiator class. The crews morbidly joked that of course it would die, but hopefully it had put up an entertaining fight. By this time, the Terran economy had come into its full strength and the conflict began to unbalance. Unharried at home, Terrara's production facilities shifted into high gear, gritting their teeth for the cold plunge into full-scale war in response to the development of viable ion shielding and High Command's decision to abandon energy weapons. The first of the Mk3 South was authorized, ominously designated by their crews as the Reaper due to their dark coloring and baleful look. The Mk3 South were redesigned from the ground up to be the backbone of Terrara's offensive fleet. Although they reserved the standards for armor and redundant systems, ion shielding was layered over the hull, plating to dissipate energy blasts. The number of drive engines was doubled, augmented with old-school chemical propellants for extra thrust during crunch time, and the jump drives upgraded to more accurate models. Point defense turrets with high rates of fire were positioned at key points along the frame. The Mark 7S were scrapped, replaced by the first railguns. The Mark 1 mass driver was developed to fire kinetic rounds at just under Mach 6. DARPA neural network interface allowed the gunner to be plugged directly into the targeting systems, seeing what the computer saw. It was standardized on a 1,500 kilograms tungsten slug, but also supplied with a selection of sabot, AP shells, and high explosive rounds. The crews lovingly nicknamed the 120,000 kilograms gun Boss Hog. Terra finally had a broadside-line ship, a hull that could take a hit and guns to throw it back as hard as it got. Xenos call them dreadnoughts. At least that's what the translation software throws up. Their languages smash the words for tan and war together, then weld the word devil on the front. Seasoned with dog, an animal they find terrifying. And you have a word that tastes like catching a fist with your teeth, but Terran have their own word. They call them destroyers. The Shriek didn't understand why Terran used kinetic weapons. They're heavy, bulky, prone to failure, inaccurate, and the logistics of resupplying fleets are horrific. Energy weapons have less recoil, can sustain fire for as long or longer than the engines, are nearly 100% accurate, and have muzzle velocities far faster than any kinetic round. But ion shielding is useless against solid slugs, and ships armored against Thought's kinetic rounds burn through fuel cells like a fat lady through sweets. If you're willing to expend chemical propellants, it's possible to launch ordnance dumps into orbit. And from there, supply runs, even through enemy void space, carry little risk with jump drives. If you have some suicidal tendencies, you can deal with the hazards of traditional round malfunctions and thermal transfer in the void, allowing the use of CIWS, eliminating smaller threats. And with Terrara's careful maneuvering during the war, the Shriek remained isolated, and it is believed unlikely other species know of Terrara's tactics. One-Tan, hammered out of his mind, had unwittingly redefined galactic warfare. The Aggressor-class Mach 6 destroyer is the pinnacle of the Terran war machine, holds a crew of just over 6,000, as well as a full brigade of elite shock troops. The hull is over a meter thick of composite reactive armor, networked with conductive filaments to mitigate the thermal transfer of a plasma cannon. Honeycombed with internal reinforcement in case of hull breach, able to withstand the sucker punch of a kinetic. Layered over the armor are shields powered by 8 nuclear reactors buried in the ship's belly. Every panel of hull plating is meticulously angled to scatter incoming sensor pings, making it virtually invisible to a computer. Despite 8 massive drive engines on separate fuel cell infrastructure and emergency chemical propulsion systems, it's estimated to have an operational combat duration of over 3 months in deep space without refueling, twice as long if the artificial gravity and shields are disabled. This destroyer has the most advanced jump drives constructed to date, able to hurdle the Tesseracts and Pentaracts halfway across the galaxy every 27 minutes. Hangar bays, infantry barracks, 4 mess halls, a couple rec rooms, 2 gyms, pools, football fields, and a few really big guns. Armament is centered around the newly designed Mark V mass driver. 6-3 gunhouses command the void in every direction. The Mark IV is still standardized on the 1,500 kilograms tungsten slug, but now with a muzzle velocity over Mach 9. Neural network interface allows the gunner to be plugged directly into the computer, giving unparalleled target acquisition and accuracy. Xeno ships are venting Atma before they've realized there's a hostile. ADD 30mm chain cannons firing depleted uranium shells, torpedo bays, and missile batteries for hard target impacts and round-off, with failing CIWs for point defense. And it sums to the apex predator of the void. The Mk6 has never seen combat, and many Terran pray it never will. Its secondary job is much more fun anyway, keeping allied galactic confederations aware they want to stay allied. Terran are new to the game. They were just learning the rules and didn't have any time to practice before their hand was forced. But Terran don't fight fair and they're very sore losers.